lightning talks. Now, the lightning talk speakers were all selected from an open call that we ran publicly on social media. We had over 70+ applications, so it was a really, really hard task to whittle it down. I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Hussein Danish, who will talk about the journey to becoming an engineering manager at Spotify. Over to Hussein.
Assalamu alaikum. Can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. So, my name is Hussein, and I'm here to talk to you about my journey to becoming an engineering manager at Spotify. I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty happy with where I am at work right now and in my career, and I hope that with my talk, you'll be able to get to that, or if you're not, or if that you're already there. So, have any of you ever experienced a sense of dread on, let's say, a Sunday night before going to work the next morning? Yes, okay. Do any of you not know who this is? I mean, for those of you who don't know, this is a screenshot from the movie Office Space, and this character is a stereotypical bad manager, and it's the type of person who makes you dread going to work the next morning. And I had a similar feeling to this on a given Sunday night in early 2020, and so I just was not looking forward to going to work the next morning, so I just went online, I went to Spotify's website, I found 2 jobs, 2 data engineering jobs, one in the US, one in Sweden, and I just hit apply, and I went to bed. Next morning, I woke up, checked my inbox, I had an email, and it said, "We want to interview you at Spotify." And I was like, my mind was blown, because this never happens. Usually you apply to something, you never hear back, it takes a long time, and I was like, oh, this is very odd. So before I tell you about the rest of the story, let me tell you a little bit about me. So obviously my name is Hussein, I'm born in Egypt. My family moved to Canada when I was 1 year old. I studied software engineering, and I had a bit of a dream related to this image. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, did I have a dream to become Brad Pitt or Jonah Hill? To which I'll just answer yes. But other than being a big music nerd, I'm a huge fan of sports, and I thought to myself, if I can combine kind of sports and quantitative things and get into sports analytics, that would be amazing. But first, after finishing my undergrad in software engineering, I just needed to get a job. So this is me at my first job. I worked at an IT consulting company called Longbow Advantage that specialized in supply chain logistics. This is a far cry away from working in music or tech or anything kind of quote-unquote cool. But interestingly, I just applied to a bunch of jobs that I found, and this one, as I was interviewing, 2 of the people interviewing me were called Ahmad and Ashraf, and I just had a good vibe from the place. And I ended up working there for 7 years. I learned a lot. It probably was 3 years too long, but I learned a lot. I did a whole bunch of troubleshooting at that job. I spent lots of time reading logs, but I also spent lots of time speaking to warehouse workers, IT professionals, even lots of company execs when things would be getting critical. It's basically a lot of time spent understanding customers. And I think that's something very useful. And I look back at this job, and now what I want to tell for all of you is don't take any of your current experiences for granted, because maybe it'll be something you'll be sitting in an empty warehouse staging lane about to launch a new warehouse, and you're like, what am I doing here? But you're probably learning some really key skills that you can take with you further in your career. So next thing that I did in my career was that I moved to a company called SSENSE. Have any of you heard of SSENSE? Any fashionistas? Or all the brands that have stores around here, most of them are sold at SSENSE. SSENSE is an e-com retailer that sells designer and luxury fashion. It's based in Montreal. At this point, I had been, like I said, at Longbow for 7 years. I wanted to do something else. I had also done a master's in data science, and so I was looking to pivot into either data science or data engineering. And so as I was looking through LinkedIn, I kept seeing this job for SSENSE, and it said, be one of the first 10 applicants. And I had no idea what it was, and so I just kept ignoring it. And I ignored it for weeks or months at a time until I realized, well, I'm not getting any answers back anywhere, and there's also no money in sports analytics, so I'm not sure I want to do that. So I ended up applying there, and I actually interviewed in one of those like glass rooms that you can see there, and the company for me was very different than anything I had been used to, because it's both a tech company and a fashion company. So you have like people working in the fashion industry, a big creative community, and like there's a certain cool vibe to it to a certain extent, which also was like very much outside my comfort zone. But ultimately, that's kind of a good thing. And so I did the interview, and funnily enough, one of the main people interviewing me was called Amir. And I had 3 great years of that company. I learned a lot. I made a lot of friends. But ultimately, by the end of my time at SSENSE, they didn't really support me where I wanted to go in my career, because I had sort of built up a team at that company, but I was not a manager, and they didn't really support me in wanting to become a manager. So I ended up moving on. So going back to the start of my story, this time I was about to do my first tech, or the HR screen with Spotify, which went well, and then I had a tech screen that you do on the phone. And this time I was not interviewing with Ahmed, Ashraf, or Amir. I was interviewing with Bjorn and Knut. So I did that interview. It went relatively well, and then they told me, we want to have an on-site interview with you. And so I was kind of freaking out, because I had not prepared for any of this, because I just went online and hit apply. But a few months prior to that, I had done an interview at Google, which did not go well at all. But at the very least, I learned a lot about interviewing for tech companies, because prior to that, I wasn't really used to the tech loop, where you usually have like a design interview, a programming interview, a domain interview, and some sort of values interview. So I at least had some exposure to that, and that allowed me to prepare a little bit for the upcoming interviews. And so one day I left work. I went home, packed my bags, was getting ready to go to Sweden to do my on-site interviews, and then the recruiter called me on the phone, and she was like, hold on, stay there. COVID's happening, everything is shutting down, so we're going to reschedule and we're going to figure it out. And this obviously was a bit of a setback. At the time, this was March 2020, nobody knew what was happening. But long story short, I ended up doing the interviews remotely, which was a very weird experience, because nobody was used to kind of speaking remotely at the time. I was at home with a laptop, talking to people that I didn't see, and just going on with like no feedback. But it went well. I ended up getting hired, and I moved to Sweden in August of 2020 without ever having set foot in the country before. Interestingly enough, on the same day that I started, there was another person who joined in the team called Dan. And I subsequently found out later from the manager that hired both of us that there was only one role open for this position, but she ended up hiring both of us, because as it turns out, Dan was really strong in both the system design and the programming interview, and I was like okay at those, but I excelled a lot at both the domain interview, which really involved troubleshooting. It was like you got a graph of data, and they were like, what do you think happened? Pretend we're a computer. And so all of those years that I spent troubleshooting logs was like very useful for me. And then I also did really well at the values interview, because I spent most of my career talking to people, understanding the consumer needs. So all that to say, like, when you are interviewing for a tech company, even if you don't think that you have the strongest tech skills, a lot of these things you can learn, but like think of the whole package. And interestingly enough, both of us ended up becoming managers of our respective teams. And so shout out to Anna, my former manager, who hired both of us and took a risk on both of us. So how did I become a manager? Let me just see, was this gonna, no, never mind. It's supposed to be a GIF, but it doesn't matter. So like I said, at SSENSE, I didn't really have any support, but at Spotify, when I joined, my manager actually encouraged me to become a manager and supported me in becoming a manager. And I think that's something that I also want to emphasize for all of you, especially if you're working like in a tech company, is that your manager is there to support you. Like that's part of their goal, and that's part of my goal with my engineers. We're there to support you and make sure that you're doing the right job. But you also need to be clear about what you want to do, because I think earlier on in my career, I wasn't always clear and explicit about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And so while your manager should be there to help you, you also need to be clear about what you want. And one really important thing that I want to emphasize as well as you go in your career and seniority, I think this was mentioned in some of the previous talks, but storytelling is probably one of the most valuable skills that you can pick up. Like, I think my job now is almost to be more of a storyteller than anything, because I have to tell a story to the people on my team, and I also have to tell a story to the people that are reporting up to me. So I'm going to close with 3 rules that I want you to kind of remember from kind of my story. So the first is don't take anything for granted. Like, I worked a lot in the warehouses all over the world, in the middle of nowhere in the US, where all I had to eat for lunch was to go to a truck stop, and they had all-you-can-eat burgers, which was a very weird experience. But don't take any of those learnings for granted, because you never know how they might come and help you later. Also, don't close any doors prematurely. So like when I was applying to SSENSE, I kept seeing this thing on LinkedIn that I had no idea what it was. And if I hadn't applied, maybe I wouldn't be where I am today. So don't close any doors prematurely. And also, be prepared, but don't force things to happen. So I went to the Spotify interview. I did well, alhamdulillah, but it helped that I had done some previous interviews before that. But like, I look back on my career, and a lot of it is just kind of, it almost seems like it's coincidence. I just stumbled into things and they happen to work. Or you can think of them as blessings and God kind of having opened the right doors at the right time. And so remember, it's not a race. You don't need to compare yourself to others. Make sure to focus on your health, both mental and physical. And then finally, 2 last things that I think have been very important for me, and I want to emphasize them for you, is both patience, sabr, and gratitude, shukr, because it's taken me a fairly long time to get to where I am today, but I think I've been patient along the way. And I'm very grateful for the experiences that I had previously. And I hope that we can all be grateful for the experiences that we have, and then pass that along to the people that we are working with, whether you are managing them, whether they're your manager, or whether they're just your peer. So thank you very much, and have a good day.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your journey.